The sun hung low over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Westwood, casting a golden glow on the rows of neat houses and manicured lawns. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, a community that prided itself on safety and belonging. But beneath the serene surface, tensions could rise in ways no one anticipated. Emily Carter stepped outside her home, her arms full of balloons and decorations. Today was a special day, her son Nathan's 7th birthday. The backyard was already set up with colorful tables, a bouncing castle, and a cake big enough to make any kid's eyes light up. For Emily, this wasn't just about celebrating Nathan. It was about creating memories, one she hoped he'd cherish forever. As she walked back into the house, Emily felt the warmth of her neighbors' smiles and greetings. She loved her community, despite the challenges that came with being one of the few Black families in the area. Her husband, William, was a respected police captain in the city, known for his fairness and dedication. But even with his position, Emily was no stranger to the subtle, and sometimes overt, biases that lingered around her. Inside the house, Emily checked the time. Guests would arrive soon, and everything was almost ready. Nathan was running around, giggling with his friends who had come early. His laughter echoed through the house, filling Emily's heart with joy. Yet, just as she reached for the last set of balloons to hang outside, her phone buzzed on the counter. The text was from her neighbor, Mrs. Linda. "Emily, everything okay? Saw a couple of police cars pull up in front of your house. Looks odd." Emily's heart skipped a beat. Police cars. She hadn't called anyone, and William was at work. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they were just passing through. Still, a sense of unease settled over her as she peeked out the window. Sure enough, 2 police cruisers were parked at the curb, lights flashing but no sirens. 2 officers, one tall and imposing, the other younger and hesitant, were walking up her driveway. Emily opened the door, her smile polite but cautious. "Can I help you, officers?" The taller one, Officer Reynolds, didn't return her smile. His eyes scanned her up and down, then the house behind her, as if looking for something or someone. "We received a report of a suspicious individual breaking into this property," he said, his tone flat and professional. Emily blinked, confused. "This is my home. I live here with my husband and son." Reynolds didn't seem convinced. "Ma'am, do you have any identification to prove that?" Emily felt a flush of irritation but kept her voice steady. "Of course, let me grab it." As she turned to step inside, the younger officer, Martinez, shifted uncomfortably. "Reynolds," he muttered, "maybe we should." Reynolds cut him off. "Protocol," he said firmly. When Emily returned with her ID, she handed it to Reynolds. He glanced at it, then back at her. "We'll need to verify this." "Verify?" Emily repeated, her tone sharper now. "I just told you, this is my home. My neighbors can confirm it." But Reynolds wasn't listening. His hand was already on his radio, calling in her details. Emily's frustration grew as she noticed a small crowd gathering outside, neighbors curious about the commotion. She could see Mrs. Linda among them, her expression a mix of worry and disbelief. Nathan, hearing the voices, ran to the door. "Mom, what's going on?" Emily turned, her heart sinking as she saw her son's confused face. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said, forcing a calm tone. "Go back inside." But before she could shield Nathan from what was unfolding, Reynolds stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us for further questioning." Emily froze. "Come with you? What are you talking about? I've done nothing wrong." Reynolds remained stoic. "We have a report, ma'am. Until we can verify." "You're arresting me?" Emily's voice rose, incredulous. "In front of my child? In my own home?" The tension in the air was palpable. Martinez looked increasingly uneasy, glancing between Emily and the growing crowd. "Reynolds," he started again, but the senior officer was already reaching for his cuffs. Emily stood her ground, her voice steady but filled with anger. "This is a mistake. My name is Emily Carter. My husband is Captain William Carter of the Westwood Police Department. Call him." Reynolds paused for a fraction of a second, his expression unreadable. Then he shook his head. "If that's true, we'll confirm it at the station." Before Emily could protest further, the cuffs were snapped onto her wrists. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Nathan burst into tears, his cries piercing through the tense silence. Emily's heart shattered as she was led to the patrol car. She turned to Mrs. Linda, who was already pulling out her phone to record. "Tell William," Emily said, her voice firm despite the sting of humiliation. "Tell him what's happening." As the car door slammed shut, Emily looked out at the faces of her neighbors, some shocked, some angry, some recording every moment. Her son's tear-streaked face was the last thing she saw before the car began to pull away. Inside the patrol car, Emily's mind raced. She knew this wasn't just about her. This was about something bigger, something deeper, that needed to be confronted. And she silently vowed, no matter what happened next, she wouldn't let this go. The car moved through the quiet streets of Westwood, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off houses and trees. Emily sat in the back, her hands bound by cold metal cuffs, her mind swirling with disbelief and anger. How had a simple day of celebration turned into this? She stared out the window, trying to piece together what could have led to such an absurd misunderstanding. Her thoughts were interrupted by the voice of Officer Martinez. "Reynolds, don't you think we should double-check this? Something doesn't feel right." Reynolds, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone was sharp. "Protocol is protocol. You don't question it." Martinez glanced at Emily in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed. "I just think we could have handled it differently. There was no reason to escalate." Emily locked eyes with him in the mirror, her gaze steady and full of restrained fury. "You think?" she said, her voice cold. "Because I'm the one sitting here, humiliated in front of my son, wondering why you couldn't take 5 minutes to ask my neighbors or call my husband. What kind of protocol justifies this?" Martinez's face reddened and he looked away, his discomfort evident. Reynolds remained silent, his jaw clenched as they approached the station. The ride felt endless, and Emily's mind drifted to William. He had always warned her about situations like this, even as he worked tirelessly to change the culture within his department. "People won't always see you as my wife first," he'd said once, his tone heavy with experience. "You have to be careful, even here." She had brushed it off then, not wanting to believe that her husband's rank or their seemingly safe neighborhood wouldn't shield her from prejudice. Now, his words echoed in her mind like a warning she wished she'd taken more seriously. When they arrived at the station, Emily was escorted inside. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the sterile smell of the precinct hit her like a wave. She caught glimpses of officers and staff stopping to watch as she was led down the hall. Whispers followed her, a mix of confusion and curiosity. She was placed in a small interrogation room, the walls bare and uninviting. Martinez uncuffed her hands and offered a mumbled apology, but Emily didn't acknowledge it. She sat down, her back straight, her anger simmering just below the surface. "Wait here," Reynolds said curtly before leaving the room, Martinez trailing behind him. The door closed, and Emily was left alone with her thoughts. The adrenaline that had kept her sharp during the ordeal began to fade, replaced by a deep, gnawing exhaustion. She thought about Nathan, his tearful face burned into her memory. How would she explain this to him? How would William react when he found out? The door opened suddenly, breaking her thoughts. A woman in plain clothes entered, her badge clipped to her belt. She introduced herself as Detective Harper, her tone professional but not unkind. "Mrs. Carter, I'm here to ask a few questions," Harper began, sitting across from her. Emily's eyes narrowed. "I've already told your officers who I am, and that this is a mistake. Before you ask me anything, you should know my husband is Captain William Carter. I suggest you call him." Harper's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Recognition, maybe. "We're working on that, ma'am. In the meantime, can you tell me what happened earlier today?" Emily leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "What happened is your officers showed up at my house with no explanation, humiliated me in front of my son and neighbors, and dragged me here for no reason. That's what happened." Harper nodded, scribbling something in her notebook. "I understand this is upsetting. but we received a call from a neighbor reporting suspicious activity at your address. Can you think of anyone who might have made that call?" Emily's mind raced. Her neighbors had always been kind, if sometimes overly curious. She couldn't imagine any of them calling the police on her. But then again, it wasn't the first time she felt the undercurrent of judgment from some people in the community. "No," she said finally. "I can't think of anyone." Harper studied her for a moment before closing her notebook. "All right, we'll verify your information and get this sorted out as quickly as possible." She stood to leave but paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I don't think you belong here, Mrs. Carter. Let me see what I can do." When Harper left, Emily exhaled a shaky breath. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope that this nightmare might end soon. But the anger remained, simmering just beneath the surface. In the hallway, Harper caught up with Reynolds and Martinez. "What's the status on contacting Captain Carter?" she asked, her tone brisk. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "We're working on it. His phone's going straight to voicemail." Harper frowned. "And you're sure about the call that came in?" "No doubts about its validity." Reynolds hesitated. "It came from an anonymous number, but the details matched. A black woman was seen entering the house and acting suspiciously." Harper's eyes narrowed. "That's all you had? No follow-up? No confirmation from other neighbors?" Martinez spoke up, his voice quiet. "I thought we should have checked, but Reynolds insisted we move quickly." Harper's expression darkened. "You both better hope there's more to this than what it looks like. If not, you just opened a can of worms we don't need." Back in the interrogation room, Emily's frustration grew with every passing minute. She thought about the anonymous call and what it represented. It wasn't just about her. It was about a system that allowed assumptions and biases to dictate actions. Her thoughts were interrupted when the door opened again. This time, it wasn't Harper, but someone she recognized instantly. William stood in the doorway, his presence commanding as always, but his face was a mask of controlled fury. "Emily," he said, his voice steady but edged with anger. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of emotion. Humiliation at having to see her husband in this context, at having to be rescued from an injustice that should never have happened. William turned to the officers behind him, his tone cold. "Who's responsible for this?" The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Emily watched her husband, her heart heavy with a mix of gratitude and anger. She didn't know how this would end, but one thing was clear: they weren't going to let this slide. William's presence seemed to shift the energy in the room. Emily had always admired the way he carried himself, calm, composed, but with a quiet authority that made people take notice. Yet, as he stood there, she could see the fire in his eyes, a spark he rarely let others see. He stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him. The click echoed like a warning. "Emily, are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft but clipped, as though he was restraining a tidal wave of emotion. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "But this is beyond ridiculous." His jaw tightened, and he nodded, his hand briefly touching hers before he turned back toward the officers who had followed him in. Martinez looked uneasy, shifting on his feet, while Reynolds tried to maintain his composure, though there was a slight tremor in his stance. "What's the explanation for this?" William asked, his voice cold and commanding. "Because I can't think of a single protocol that justifies arresting my wife in front of our child without so much as verifying the facts." Reynolds cleared his throat. "Captain Carter, we were responding to a call, an anonymous tip about suspicious activity. We acted based on the information we had at the time." William took a step closer to him, his eyes narrowing. "An anonymous tip? That's your justification. Did you bother to confirm anything? Did you speak to any other neighbors or even knock on the door to see what was going on?" Martinez, sensing the growing tension, tried to intervene. "Sir, I suggested we double-check, but Reynolds insisted we act quickly." "Quickly?" William repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You acted recklessly. Do you realize what you've done? You humiliated my wife in front of our son, in our community. Do you have any idea what kind of message that sends?" Reynolds opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. William shook his head, exhaling sharply. This isn't just about Emily. It's about the way you approached the situation, the assumptions you made. You think you can hide behind procedure, but this wasn't protocol. It was prejudice. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. Emily watched her husband, a mixture of pride and sadness filling her chest. This wasn't the first time he'd had to address these kinds of issues within his department, but it was the first time it had hit so close to home. As the officers shifted uncomfortably, the door opened again, and Detective Harper entered, her face unreadable. She glanced between William and the officers before addressing him directly. Captain Carter, I've been reviewing the details, and I agree there were significant lapses in how this was handled, she said carefully. I've already started taking steps to address it. And what steps are those? William asked, his voice calm but firm. For starters, Mrs. Carter's record will show no trace of this incident. I'm also requesting a full review of the call that initiated this response. It came from an untraceable number, which raises questions about its credibility. We'll get to the bottom of it. William studied her for a moment before nodding. I appreciate that, Detective. But this doesn't end with wiping the slate clean. I expect accountability, not just for my wife's sake, but for anyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation. Harper nodded, her expression serious. Understood, sir. I'll make sure this is handled thoroughly. As Harper left the room, Emily leaned back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her. The adrenaline that had kept her sharp was fading, leaving behind a hollow ache in her chest. William sat beside her, his hand covering hers. This isn't over, he said quietly. Not until we make sure it doesn't happen again. Emily nodded, her resolve strengthening. She thought about Nathan, about the tears in his eyes as he watched her being taken away. She thought about the neighbors who had watched silently, some curious, others indifferent. And she thought about the anonymous call, the voice that had set this chain of events in motion. Later that evening, after they had returned home, Emily sat in the living room, her mind racing. William was on the phone, speaking in low, measured tones as he updated a colleague on what had happened. Nathan was upstairs, asleep after a long, emotional day, but she couldn't relax. Her thoughts kept circling back to the call. Who had made it, and why? Was it someone who had a personal vendetta against her or William? Or was it a stranger, someone who had seen her skin color and assumed the worst? The questions gnawed at her, each one more unsettling than the last. The following day, William requested a meeting with the department's internal affairs team. As they sat in a sterile conference room, he laid out his concerns, detailing the mishandling of the incident and the broader implications it had for the department. This isn't just about Emily, he said, his tone steady but impassioned. It's about the culture that allowed this to happen. If we don't address it now, we're setting a dangerous precedent. The team listened carefully, taking notes and nodding in agreement. But as William spoke, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There were too many loose ends, too many unanswered questions. In the days that followed, she and William began piecing together the fragments of the incident, determined to uncover the truth. They spoke to neighbors, reviewed surveillance footage, and pushed the department for answers. What they discovered would change everything. But that revelation was still out of reach, lingering just beyond the horizon, waiting to come to light. The tension remained, a constant undercurrent that refused to dissipate. Emily knew they were far from resolving the conflict, but one thing was certain, they wouldn't stop until they uncovered the truth. In the days that followed, the Carter household felt like it was running on sheer determination. William worked tirelessly both at home and in the precinct, balancing his responsibilities as a police captain with his personal mission to find justice for Emily. Emily, in turn, threw herself into her own research. She spent hours sifting through information, reaching out to community leaders, and connecting with others who had faced similar injustices. The anonymous call haunted her thoughts, and she couldn't let it go. Late one evening, after Nathan had gone to bed, Emily and William sat together in their living room. The coffee table was covered in papers, police reports, and notes they had compiled. A small notebook lay open in front of Emily, filled with names and snippets of conversations she'd had with neighbors. I talked to Mrs. Peterson earlier, Emily said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. She mentioned seeing a strange car parked on the street the day of the incident. She said it wasn't anyone from the neighborhood. William nodded, rubbing his temples. We've pulled traffic camera footage, but it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. Harper's team is combing through it, but it's going to take time. Emily leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Who would do this, William? Who would want to hurt us like this? William reached for her hand, his grip firm but comforting. We'll figure it out. Whoever it was, they didn't count on us fighting back. But as determined as they were, the situation grew more complicated. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Emily noticed her car had been tampered with, small, subtle changes that she almost didn't catch. A neighbor reported seeing someone lurking near their house late at night. And then there were the calls, anonymous, unsettling, and always just silence on the other end of the line. It felt as though someone was watching, waiting, trying to intimidate them into silence. But instead of backing down, it only strengthened their resolve. Emily refused to be a victim, and William knew he couldn't let fear control their lives. One afternoon, Emily decided to visit the precinct herself. She had questions, and she wasn't going to sit idly by while others saw answers on her behalf. As she walked into the building, heads turned. Some officers greeted her warmly, while others avoided her gaze, clearly uncomfortable. Detective Harper met her in the hallway. "Mrs. Carter," she said with a nod. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I needed to speak with you directly," Emily replied. "Have you made any progress?" Harper hesitated, then gestured for Emily to follow her to a small conference room. Once inside, Harper closed the door and lowered her voice. "We've identified the vehicle that was seen on your street that day. It's registered to a known associate of a man your husband arrested last year, Marcus Calloway. Does that name ring a bell?" Emily's heart sank. Calloway was a notorious figure in the community, known for his criminal activities and his deep disdain for law enforcement. William had been instrumental in his arrest, leading to a lengthy prison sentence. "You think this is retaliation?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's possible," Harper replied. "We're looking into his associates, trying to trace the call. But there's something else." She hesitated, as though weighing her words. "The officer who insisted on your arrest, Reynolds, he's been in contact with Calloway's brother. I'm not sure what it means yet, but it's suspicious." Emily's mind raced. Could Reynolds have been part of a larger scheme? Was this personal vendetta being orchestrated from the shadows? The idea made her stomach churn. As Emily left the precinct, her thoughts were a whirlwind. She called William, filling him in on what Harper had told her. His response was calm but intense, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "We're getting closer," he said. "But we need to be careful. If Calloway's people are involved, this could get dangerous." That night, William stayed up late, poring over files and making calls. Emily tried to sleep but found herself staring at the ceiling, her mind too active to rest. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the walls around them weren't as safe as they seemed. And then, just as the first hints of dawn began to light the sky, the sound of shattering glass broke the stillness. Emily bolted upright, her heart pounding. William was already on his feet, reaching for the phone as he rushed toward the noise. The living room window was smashed, shards of glass scattered across the floor. In the center of the chaos lay a brick, wrapped in a piece of paper. William picked it up carefully, his jaw tightening as he read the note scrawled on it. Asterisk, "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Asterisk. Emily's blood ran cold. This was no longer just about clearing her name. It was a threat, a warning, a promise of further harm if they didn't back down. But backing down wasn't an option, not for William, not for Emily. They had come too far, uncovered too much. The truth was within reach, but so was the danger. And as the sun rose on another day, the Carters knew they were heading straight into the storm. As the daylight seeped into the house, the Carters found themselves grappling with the weight of the threat. William stood by the shattered window, the note still clenched in his hand, his mind racing. Emily, her hands trembling, carefully swept up the broken glass. trying to busy herself to keep the fear at bay. But the message was clear. They were no longer dealing with subtle intimidation. This was a direct warning, and whoever sent it was escalating their game. While Emily wanted to focus on protecting their home, William knew they couldn't afford to lose momentum. He contacted Detective Harper immediately, informing her of the incident. Harper promised to send a team over to collect evidence and sweep the area, but her voice carried a tone of urgency William hadn't heard before. It was as though she, too, understood that time was running out. By mid-morning, the forensic team had come and gone, leaving the Carters with more questions than answers. The brick yielded no fingerprints, and the security cameras they'd installed after the initial incident had mysteriously stopped working the night before. It was almost too perfect, too orchestrated, to be a coincidence. Emily decided to focus on what she could control. She reached out to a local community leader, Pastor Hill, who had always been a trusted figure in their neighborhood. Pastor Hill, a man with deep ties to both the community and law enforcement, offered to meet with Emily to discuss what was happening. When she arrived at the church that afternoon, Pastor Hill greeted her with his usual warmth, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that mirrored her own. As they sat in his modest office, Emily recounted everything that had happened, from her arrest to the note that shattered their sense of safety. "I've seen this before," Pastor Hill said after a long pause. "When people start digging where they're not supposed to, those in power, or those protecting something, will do whatever it takes to silence them. But this feels different, more personal." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, leaning forward. Pastor Hill sighed, rubbing his hands together thoughtfully. "I mean, whoever's behind this isn't just trying to scare you. They're trying to break you. This isn't about a random mistake or a grudge. This is calculated." Emily's mind raced. Could this go deeper than she and William had initially thought? She thanked Pastor Hill and left the church feeling both comforted by his support and unnerved by his words. Meanwhile, William was following another lead. Harper had managed to dig up records showing that Reynolds, the officer who'd arrested Emily, had received several large deposits into an offshore account over the past 6 months. It wasn't definitive proof of corruption, but it was enough to warrant further investigation. As William sat in his office, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Asterisk. "You don't know who you're dealing with. Stop now." Asterisk. William's pulse quickened. He immediately traced the number through the precinct's system, but it led to a burner phone, another dead end. Frustration gnawed at him, but he refused to give up. That evening, as the family tried to settle into some semblance of normalcy, a knock at the door startled them. William cautiously opened it to find a young woman standing there, her face pale and her hands clutching a small envelope. "Are you Captain Carter?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I am. Who are you?" "My name is Tasha," she said, glancing over her shoulder as though she feared being followed. "I work at the precinct. Well, I used to. I quit last month because I couldn't take it anymore. But I know what's happening to your family, and I think I can help." Emily stepped forward, her curiosity outweighing her fear. "Come inside," she said, ushering Tasha in. Once seated, Tasha handed William the envelope. "I found these before I left. They're copies of reports. Altered ones. Officer Reynolds and a few others have been covering up evidence, planting false information. It's all tied to a larger operation. I don't know everything, but I know enough to see that they're trying to protect someone high up." William opened the envelope and scanned the documents inside. His jaw tightened as he recognized the names and dates, cases he'd worked on, arrests he'd made, all of them connected to Calloway and his network. "Why are you telling us this?" Emily asked, her tone cautious. Tasha hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. "Because I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you. They've been watching you, Mrs. Carter. They knew exactly when and where to target you that day. It wasn't random. They wanted to send a message." The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. This wasn't just about Emily's arrest or William's career. This was a battle against a deeply entrenched system of corruption, one that had already taken aim at their family and wasn't done yet. Before Tasha left, She handed William another piece of paper with an address scribbled on it. "This is where they meet," she said. "It's risky, but if you want answers, you'll find them there." After she was gone, William and Emily sat together in their living room, the air heavy with tension. They knew the risks of pursuing the lead, but they also knew they couldn't stop now. As night fell, the Carters prepared themselves for the next step, unaware that the decision they were about to make would bring them closer to the truth, but at a cost they hadn't yet imagined. As the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the city, William and Emily prepared for the confrontation that lay ahead. The address Tasha had provided led them to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place that looked as abandoned as it did foreboding. William, armed with his badge, a concealed weapon, and an unwavering determination, parked the car a block away. Emily, against his wishes, refused to stay behind. She wasn't just his wife tonight. She was his partner in uncovering the truth. They approached the warehouse cautiously, the quiet of the night amplifying every sound. The crunch of gravel beneath their feet, the distant hum of the city, the occasional bark of a dog. As they reached the side entrance, William pressed his ear to the door, hearing muffled voices inside. Emily's heart raced, her mind replaying the threats they'd received and the risks they were taking. But she refused to let fear consume her. Not now. Pushing the door open slowly, they slipped inside. The interior was dimly lit, with scattered crates and shadows that seemed to dance against the walls. Following the voices, they moved deeper into the building, keeping to the edges to avoid detection. What they found chilled them to their core. In the center of the room was a makeshift office, illuminated by a single overhead light. Inside, Officer Reynolds sat at a table with two men in suits, their conversation too low to make out, but the tension was palpable. William gestured for Emily to stay back as he crept closer. His heart pounded in his chest as he strained to hear. Words like payoff, shipment, and cleanup floated through the air, confirming his suspicions. This wasn't just about corruption within the precinct. This was an organized operation, and Reynolds was at the center of it. Suddenly, one of the men stood, his voice rising in anger. "You said Carter was taken care of. Now he's sniffing around, and we've got loose ends everywhere. If this blows up, it's on you." Reynolds looked nervous, glancing around as though he sensed he was being watched. "I told you, I'm handling it." His wife's arrest should have been enough to scare him off, but he's too stubborn. "Give me more time." Emily's hand tightened on William's arm, her fear and anger intertwining. They had been targeted deliberately, their lives appended by a network that thrived on power and secrecy. William decided it was time to act. Stepping into the light, he revealed himself, his badge gleaming in the dim glow. "Time's up, Reynolds." The room erupted into chaos. Reynolds jumped to his feet, reaching for his weapon, but William was faster. "Don't," William warned, his voice steady and commanding. "This ends now." The two men in suits exchanged a glance before bolting for the back exit. Emily, without hesitation, moved to block their path, her phone raised. "Stop right there. I've got everything recorded." One of the men sneered, lunging toward her, but William's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Touch her, and you won't make it out of here." Reynolds, seeing his allies flee, raised his hands in mock surrender. "You got nothing, Carter. No proof, no backup. You think this little stunt is going to take us down?" William smirked, stepping closer. "Proof? You just gave me everything I needed." He motioned to a tiny recording device clipped to his belt. The sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Emily had texted Detective Harper their location minutes earlier, and now the cavalry had arrived. Within moments, officers stormed the warehouse, arresting Reynolds and the remaining men. As the dust settled, Harper approached William and Emily, her face a mixture of relief and pride. "You two have guts, I'll give you that, but don't ever pull something like this again without backup." William nodded, exhaustion overtaking him. "We didn't have a choice. This needed to end." In the days that followed, the investigation unraveled a web of corruption that reached higher than anyone had anticipated. Politicians, business executives, and even a few high-ranking officers were implicated. The city was rocked by the revelations, but for the Carters, it was a bittersweet victory. Just when they thought the ordeal was behind them, a package arrived at their doorstep. Inside was a single photograph, a family picture of William, Emily, and their children. Scrawled across the back were the words, "This isn't over." Emily felt a chill run down her spine as William examined the photo, his jaw tightening. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. As they looked at each other, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They would face whatever came next, together, no matter the cost. The fight for justice wasn't just about taking down those who abused their power. It was about protecting the people they loved and the values they stood for. And for William and Emily Carter, the fight was only beginning.